webinar today. We'll start off with a conversation around the evolution of contact management, particularly in police control rooms, and how that might have changed over time. So really there's 5 general themes that we've seen over the past, I'd say 5 to 10 years. So the first one is just that cranking up of demand. Slowly but surely, demand has increased. But as it does increase, so too has the level of complexity. My Lego there, where it's all everything's been slightly different. But what we do see is that the handle times that have come in, they've increased as well. So that the time of the call, it might have been that historically a call lasted 4 minutes. Now it's taking 5, 6, 7 minutes. Similarly, from a crime recording point of view, so many more processes, and not to say ticking boxes, but things that need to be done as part of that crime recording adds in time and a bit more complexity, which has an impact on the resources and tying them up or utilising them a bit more. Next thing, my revolving staircase, symbolising the reduction in performance. So most organisations, ambulance, fire and police, when it comes to their contact management, have seen performance levels drop over the past 5 to 10 years. And that's problematic because if it's taking longer to answer the calls, potentially longer to dispatch, when we start to talk about response, if we're trying to respond to incidents, these grade 1 incidents that we need to get to, first of all, before those call for service comes in, you've got to have it dealt with the call to start with. So it's all very well saying we're going to get to as many incidents as we can or emergencies within 15 minutes. But if that 999 has been sitting for 2, 3, 4 minutes, actually that's going to have a problem because anything you can do to optimize response is going to be offset by the elongated times taken to dispatch. There's very much a balance there or an understanding of how that all fits in together. The final one, and I know that anyone who's been flying off recently wouldn't have seen go to gates, they would have been seeing cancellations and delays on there. But the reason we've got departures in there is very much around staff throughout call centres, particularly in policing and also in fire. The levels of staff attrition have been very high, not just during the COVID period, but historically we've seen probably the last 5 to 10 years. It used to be that a dispatcher job was a job for life. You'd come in and you'd do 20, 30 plus years in there. Now the turnover is so much quicker. And one of the things that we've heard anecdotally is that COVID has increased the attrition rates because people who are doing a similar job than they would be doing a call handling can do it from home. And actually that becomes far, far different. And we're seeing organisations struggle to recruit and retain staff. If you don't have the staff, performance starts to drop. Utilisation levels increase. When your utilisation increases, people become more stressed, more likely to be sick, more pressure on people, and actually at that point, more likely to leave. So you end up in this, this self-fulfilling prophecy, I suppose, this cycle that you'd want to try and break. So 5 general themes we've seen, but actually those are all high-level changes that are going on. What we really want to talk about is the nuts and bolts, the different functions within the police contact management and how we might look at addressing some of these. Historically, we've thought about this in 7 ways, or 7 typical areas. Now, all those are pictures, but I'm going to go through each one of them and explain the different areas of the structures and how we model or look at the differences in these. So switchboard, for example, the switchboard, historically, every police force had a switchboard. And if you weren't phoning up 999, you went through this switchboard. Now, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the switchboards, when you phoned those people, I wouldn't say they had Rottweiler tendencies, but they were certainly very keen to point out when things were and were not a police matter. And at that point, being able to turn away demand that wasn't actually police related quite quickly. We don't have that now. These calls will still enter into the contact management centre. Some forces will still have a switchboard. In many places that will be an IVR, the voice recognition piece, or pick 1 for crime, pick 2 for this type of thing. I'm sure you've all had it in terms of as you've made those calls. One of the problems we have with IVRs is we don't really know how successful they are. It's very difficult to know what they filter out or if they're actually that effective. That's something that we've always struggled to get data from different organisations on. The next question was about dispatchers. So dispatchers are the people who take the incidents that have been created, 999s, and I'm going to send out resources to them. So I'm going to find an officer, response officer, and send them to that emergency incident. Now, when we've done these sorts of projects before, looking at different dispatch functions, there tends to be one of two ways dispatches are set up. Either there's lots of talk groups with a few people in each, or there's a small number of talk groups with small number of people with big groups. So effectively, that would be you might have 15 people in one shift. In those 15 people, you might have 3 dispatch areas, a north, a south, and a central. Within those, 5 people on each dispatch group, someone who's a dispatcher, someone who's a helper, someone doing the admin, and 2 others that are floating around. Although another force might say, yes, we've got 15 people in dispatch, but rather than 3 dispatch groups, we have 5 dispatch groups where we've got a dispatcher, someone on admin, and a helper. Just different ways of structuring. Now, there's always been that question there about, well, what's right and how many talk groups should you have? Because historically, the amount of traffic that went on talk groups came back as a charge for using the telephony system there. And from our point of view, it doesn't feel like there's a right or wrong way, but it's about making sure that those talk groups are balanced. In the example, if you had 3 talk groups, where one makes up 10%, the other one makes up 30%, and if my math's right, we should have the final one making up 60% of the talk or the dispatch. I'd look at that and say, that feels like it's out of alignment. One of the other things we talk about when we look at dispatch is what are they actually picking up? So typically when we look at things around dispatch and we're benchmarking, we suggest that a dispatcher should deal with somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 grade 1 to grade 2 incidents per year. But what happens if the dispatcher also picking up scheduled and appointments, these non-critical incidents? Well, those numbers are going to change. There's a question there about how do they change and how does the organisation take this into consideration? I've also seen some very different schools of thoughts about what a dispatcher role should be. Some people would view it as a very specialist role where I've got all these incidents in front of me and I'm trying to make head nor tail about whether or not this is the most important and how do I make sure that a grade 2 incident that's been sitting for 2.5 hours, how does that get prioritised over something, a grade 1 or an emergency that's just happened? Those balances can be very challenging. So is it a specialist role or can it be done as by an omnicompetent call handler? I'm talking an awful lot here. Are there any questions at the moment?
No, all good, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. So, okay, the next part would be crime recording. So the first part of that crime recording piece is, at what point do we record crimes? Is it when someone calls up and says, I'd like to report a crime? All right, I'm the call handler, I shall record that crime. And I'll do that all the way through. Now that could be a 20, 30, 40-minute call that the person who's picked up the 101 or the 999 call would be. Alternatively, in some organisations, yeah, no problem, I'll put you through to our crime recording, have a little bit of an understanding of the incident and the crime that needs to be recorded. Right, I'm going to hand you over to a specialist crime team that will record. So there's a question there, if you're handing someone over, you've got that concept of double handling. The person, the victim, for example, would be having to replay the same information twice. So from victim satisfaction point of view, might not be the ideal way of doing it. But how many more resources do you need if you're going to do that one person, as I think one of the Welsh forces quoted, cradle to grave approach? You're going to need more people because you've got that variation. A lot of the calls will be short because there are incidents coming in. But you need to take into account the resiliency required to deal with the 30, 40-minute calls. There's also questions about the systems that are used. The adoption of things like Athena or Niche impacts the call time. We worked with one organisation who saw going to Athena was going to add 3 minutes to the the process of recording crime. Well, that extra 3 minutes increases utilisation. You may need more people overall if the workload increases substantially. Throughout a lot of the contact management piece, we will talk about omnicompetence versus specialism. Crime recording is one of those examples. It's actually quite complex to record a crime. Do you want to make sure that everyone's trained in this and they can do it and anyone can do it? Or do you want to make sure it's done right and done in the most effective way? There's also a piece around who's actually doing this crime recording. How much has been done by officers? How much has been done by civilians? And once it's done, who does the quality assurance? Who's doing the bureau, the crime bureau checks to make sure that there's compliance to the rules and regulations? So crime recording can actually be a relatively big beast as part of the contact management side of things. Certainly some of the forces we work with will have different desks, and I've used antisocial behaviour and the way it's recorded as an example of the different types of things that forces will deal with. Yes, they're going to have their 101s, their 999s, their dispatch, but they also potentially have some supplementary desks or ongoing work to deal with specific elements. For example, ASB. Based on some case law historically around Pilkington and things, there is a requirement for forces to make sure that repeat victims are receiving the necessary support they have. So yes, what might be happening on a day-to-day basis, it might be a small level ASB. But what happens if that's happening every other night, 4 times a week, for months on end? That's going to have an impact on the victim. Something within the force needs to be picking this up and making sure that these problems are addressed. So I can understand the need for an antisocial behaviour desk to make sure that these, what will seem to be low-lying problems, but there are consistent problems, are dealt with. But how do we make sure that we're dealing with the ASB in the right way? What are the steps that are correct and appropriate? And if we're doing this on an ongoing incident or ongoing element, is it time sensitive? Does that role sit with neighbourhood policing or with the force control room? There's always debates or discussions around that. Different forces have very different views on it. And depending on the road you choose to go down, it will have an impact on the resources and the structures you require. Speaking of structures, what's become a lot more popular over probably the last 5 years is the concept of incident resolution teams. So this concept, and they're called IRT in one force and a crime recording team in another, or desk-based research, or there's different wording that's used, but effectively what we're talking about is a triage team. A team that can do the lower level, deal with the lower level, the grade 2s and grade 3s that maybe don't need to be dispatched to. What if there are specific incident types that we can deal with without actually going out? Surely that saves the driving, the response, and we can pick up a phone and phone someone and be there. You know, if they pick up, I'm there within 30 seconds. That call's been sorted out. I don't have to drive 5, 10, 20 miles. But if we're going to do that, how does that function work? Does it need to be 24/7? How many police officers do we need? Do we need officers rather than staff? All those sorts of questions become quite important. I suppose the other thing there is if they're going to pick up this work, what is the implication on response? If the IRT are doing it, there's less work for response. Well, what does that mean to them? And one of the problems we've seen quite consistently, actually, when IRTs are put together, what resources go into that? Do you end up putting your restricted and recuperative officers into that area? So you're not making a crack squad of the best of the best. Actually, you're fitting in the people who actually haven't been able to go out on response because the restrictions. As a result, that might impact how effective the team is. Omnicompetence I've already touched on. The idea of trying to balance an operation that has specialisms versus the jack of all trades. If you have people who can do everything, then you're resilient. You don't need as many people there. But if I'm able to do 6 or 7 things, do I then command some sort of bonus or higher wage for that? So we've got to have an understanding of with additional skills, there's an expectation that the financial remuneration increases. So having specialists may not always be the most cost-effective way to run the operation. So you then get into situations where you may talk about an omnicompetent model and you may talk about a standard model and then mix the two. And where on that spectrum would you sit? I think different organisations have very different experiences from that. One of the things I just wanted to pick up, because Alan did mention the idea of live chat, or that concept there of digital desks in here. Something that came out yesterday was on Policing Insight. There was an article here about using live chat to improve support for domestic abuse victims. To me, that makes perfect sense. If someone's able to type, they're not on the phone, and actually in a DA environment, maybe that's a really good way to deal with being able to get the support they need. So that's going on in Suffolk just now. Sounds like a real good news story. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about it. Onto their website, live chat is currently unavailable. I'm not picking on Suffolk Constabulary here, but what I'm saying is there is an inconsistency or a requirement that if you're going to go out and say, as an organisation, we do live chat or we do certain things within our control room, you've got to put the resources in to be able to build that and maintain that. We see changes or evolution in the way that control rooms are working all the time. I think Mark will agree with me. When we do a response model, we generally think that's set up for 6 months to a year. Not a lot's going to change unless you've got changes in practices or big change in demand. You'd probably want to go quarterly when you start to look at contact management, just because things do change. Your profile of demand across when the calls are coming in, the types of calls, the mix, the process times. There's a lot of moving parts there. And actually, sometimes it's very useful to understand at, say, quarterly basis, the changes that are occurring. Okay, so I've stopped at that point around the typical areas of discussion in terms of the thematics there. Were there any questions at that point around things you saw there that you thought, actually, I didn't realise that was a case, or things that don't chime with your own force, or things that you think, actually, that's really interesting? And I will start picking on people, because I'm that kind of guy. Anyone? Okay. Mark, anything I missed?
No, it sounds we've obviously been through that sort of structure before. I think they're the key things that people are generally talking about.
Are you suggesting I recycle my slides?
No, Ali, we've prepared them perfectly just for this presentation.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay, so the next piece is that options around modelling. So we've already talked about the themes and the functions that we're looking at, but how do we bring that together in sort of an analytical model that can enable evidence-based decision making? There's a couple of options with our tools. One is Call Profiler, which I think a few of you have used before. So the concept behind Call Profiler is it very much focuses on the organisation's ability to answer those calls. It takes into account consideration like the demand that's coming in, the processing time, but also things around abandonment. Human nature. If I'm on the call, if I phone my bank this afternoon and I'm on hold for 45 minutes, at some point, I'm going to hang up the phone. So at that point, if they've not answered the phone, we've got abandonment. How do we deal with the abandonment rates there? There's going to be prioritization. Yes, you might have a pool of people who can answer 999s and 101s, but it makes sense that the organisation preserves even, to prioritise 999s. So how do we factor that into a model? Static model we can't really do, but certainly with Call Profiler we can. And then there's the piece around airline modelling, which is a bit more of the detail around how you model calls coming together. So because it's a dynamic model and we're using a simulation back end, we can understand the different shift patterns, the impact of changing priorities, or also determine the levels of resources that are required. Now, that's all well and good. And if we are just modeling the call handling part of contact management, generally that's exactly what is needed. But actually, the other things we need to take into account, some of these challenges are these ancillary desks, the ASP desk, the live chat, etc. how do we model them? Because we know that we're going to bring resources in, we're going to put people on shift pattern, and then as soon as they come on shift, people we thought we were going to have for calls, well, some of them are going to go to the ASB desk and somebody's going to go here and there. You're not actually left with the same number you started with. So we've got to understand how that works. And actually that whole non-call process can be very difficult. It wouldn't be the first time that Mark or I has gone into a contact management area and said, "Do dispatchers answer 999s?" No, never. And then you find out that if that call is ringing and there is a spare dispatcher, they'll be asked to answer 9s. And actually the processes that are in place can be a lot more fluid than would be made out. Yes, you have standard operating procedures, but when things get busy, sometimes those procedures change. So Call Profiler can be very useful, but it also has some challenges around non-standard processes. The second piece, which I think we're probably all a bit more familiar with, is the Workload Profiler. So understanding the size of the resource required. So understanding the workload that's coming in, i.e. calls that need to be dealt with, and the processes around that. What's the average number of calls that are coming in? What's the processing time? What's the wrap time that's required? So that's not just the bit of the call, but then understanding that the call handler has to do some typing and some write-up afterwards. So Workload Profiler is great because it gives us a consistent approach to do this analysis. It can give us quick results to say, how much workload is there? The problem is it's the static model. It's not taking into account interdependencies. It's not taking into account the fact there are distributions or variance when it comes to processing time. So there's a question there in terms of how useful it is for certain parts of the control room. However, for things like the ASB desk or for very standard processes, it might be useful. So we can have that sort of balance there between the call profiler and the workload profiler element. The final thing I just wanted to touch on was around control room and fire. So fire control rooms are relatively similar, but with some distinct differences to policing. This is a graph here that we've taken from one of our projects of the overall utilization of fire control operators. So this isn't just the workload, this is the emergency calls, the non-emergency calls, the incident management, the breaks, the other tasks that are taking place. And overnight, in many fire control rooms, utilization drops below 50%. In fact, I've probably been very generous here in terms of the one I've chosen to show here. That's one of the busier fire control rooms. It's typical we'd see these proportions overnight drop to 20, 30%. In fact, emergency calls and incident management can equate to only 15% of on-shift time. Everything else is the other stuff. And that's very different from what you might find in a police control room. Now in police control rooms, you are going to have busy times and you're going to have quiet times. So Tuesday morning at 4 AM, yeah, there's probably not a lot going on, but I wouldn't expect to see such low utilization factors. The difference in fire is the resilience required to deal with large scale or simultaneous incidents. Be able to make sure that when there are large fires taking place with multiple pumps going, that they have enough people to deal with it. Another factor in fire control is that a lot of the other tasks, the training, the write-ups, the learning, all take place at night. Exercises, all that sort of thing. And if you are on a night shift, it's going to be different from a day shift. And I think one of the factors that fire control operators struggle with is the fact that having to do all my training, my reading my logs, my writing up, my online learning, doing that at 2, 3, 4 in the morning actually can be very challenging. So there's always that question there of, is that right to be doing all your training at night? So some distinct differences there between what you'd expect to see in fire and what you'd expect to see in policing. To summarise in terms of, hopefully that's giving you a flavour of some of the work we've done in contact management and some of the key themes. It is continuing to evolve. We see changes in demand placed on services, and the level of complexity has only gone up in terms of probably 10 to 15 years ago, it was 999s, it was 101, dispatch, and a little bit else. Now there's a lot, that little bit else has grown, as has some of the complexity of the types of calls that are coming in and the things that are having to be dealt with. Performance, and particularly staff attrition rates, are being seen to be a challenge. And the one thing that doesn't go away, when you start to talk about a social media desk or different levels of live chat and different ways of contacting the police, all that does is ratchet up the expectation from the members of the public. Having more channels to contact you means that they're going to use those and expect quick responses, which most definitely is a challenge that some organisations are currently facing. One of the things we would typically do in a project where we're looking at the FCR is looking at things like specialist crime recorders, the need for specialist desks like antisocial behaviour, instant resolution, and also that balance around civilian versus police officer roles. There's definitely a need for having some level of officer professional judgment in the FCR. But how much? How much is too much? And obviously the difference between civilian versus police officer comes with a cost implication as well. Omnicompetence is a massive factor that we have a discussion about. You get flexibility by having omnicompetent staff. You also have the benefits of being able to specialise. If it takes, on average, the team would take 10 minutes to do something, a specialist would be able to do it in 6 or 7 minutes. Is it really the case that we want omnicompetent staff? Do you want someone filling in a crime report that hasn't done it for 3, 4, 5 months? What level of service is that giving to the customer, or the victim in this case? Fire tends to be a bit more about resource utilisations, making sure we've got resilience and we've got the right number of people to deal with those large, complex incidents. The challenge for them as well is maybe to justify what they're doing overnight and make sure that they are being productive during the downtime there. That was the presentation that I had today. I just wanted to ask if there's any questions or anything that you wanted to pick up on through that.
I think your modelling approach in fire is quite interesting, because I think it's much harder to build up a model of a resource that's doing both the call handling and the incident management piece and the dispatch piece at the same time. So for police control rooms, you generally, call profile is excellent at doing the call handling part of it. The dispatch side of it tends to be sort of a desk-based threshold level of resourcing, and your crime management teams tend to be a workload profiler type model, and that's great. You can do those 3 things in isolation and then combine the totals. But for fire, you need to account for the fact that you've got the same resource who's taking the calls, who are then also doing the incident management, and how you allow for sort of the prioritization of that work. If I'm busy managing an incident, can I then take a 999 that's coming in? Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. So it's actually, even though the utilizations are lower and the problem seems at first glance simpler, I think actually it's harder to build up a working model of a fire control room than it is a police one.
I completely agree. So one of the things doing workshops, so just before Christmas, we had someone who said, okay, on my last shift, I had to phone the council because we had to go through a door, and part of the remedy was we had to phone the council to say, look, that door needs sorted, type thing. Not saying it's trivial, it's something that needed to be done, but it didn't need to be done that moment. But as part of the incident that she was on the phone waiting to speak to the council. She waited 45 minutes. During that period, there were 3 999 calls that were on. The policy says she's already started something. She's on hold. She's got to stay on hold. Those 999s were coming in. How do you balance that out? I think that's part of the challenge that Mark's suggesting there about being able to model it and understand the differences can be quite challenging. Any thoughts from the floor?
Ali, I just wondered if you'd seen the recent publication of, obviously, I think it was the government last week published all the response times for 999 calls for all the forces across the UK. I just wondered if you'd seen that, because obviously you work with a lot of forces around the country. It reminded me, obviously, the webinar today links quite closely with that, and I just wondered if you'd seen it at all.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of benefit to that in terms of being able to understand how your local force or local organisation fits relative to others. I think there's always that challenge there, and I'm sure the managers of many contact management centres would sit here and go, well, are we all measuring the same thing? are we tasked with measuring the same thing in there? And that to me is a bit of a challenge, because yes, the question always comes back to what is being measured in the telephony system. Does the fact that you've got a switchboard mean that that call has been answered? That makes sense, because you've called and something's happened. So there is a danger there in terms of making sure that we are comparing apples with apples. As one of our clients said at one point, is like, yeah, it's all very well saying we're comparing apples with apples, but I like Braeburn, and if I'm getting a Granny Smith, that's not what I want. And there are some questions there about, is it the right metrics and the way it's being compared? But no, I think that the level of the ability to see those differences there and sort of trying to explain them, I think is really important, because it shows how your organisation sits against others. And from a benchmarking and transparency point of view, I think it's quite important. Ellie, so did Hampshire look quite good in that?
Yeah, I think we were okay. We weren't highlighted as a particularly bad or particularly good force, so I think we're kind of middle of the road, which, yeah, good and bad, I guess. But yeah, I know obviously it then puts quite a lot of sort of public eyes and scrutiny on those forces that haven't done so well. But like you say, that can be a good thing and a bad thing as well, I guess. But just in terms of obviously police confidence at the moment is particularly low, so I think things like that don't always help, but I guess longer term it makes us realise is kind of what problems we've got and need to be fixed. But I guess you can look at it both ways, really.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with you exactly there, really. I think in the short term there's a huge risk it does more harm than good, because if I'm a force who's at the bottom of that league table, I'm going to all of a sudden throw resources at my 999 call handling so that I'm not bottom next time, and that's going to be the expense of my 101, and there's some fairly serious risks sitting in that 101 queue that I'm now not answering because somebody's going to beat me up because my 999 answer was poor. Yeah. Absolutely, it has to be good and it has to improve, and performance management in general is a reasonable way of doing that. But if you only take one metric in isolation, then I think there's a huge risk behind it.
It's what I suppose is that question about the moment. It's one metric in isolation at one point in time, and I suppose from let's call it EvoSure as one constabulary, because I don't want to pick on anyone, but if you've got a force who the performance isn't great at this point in time, but when it's remeasured in 4 or 5 months' time and you can see an improvement there, to me that's far better than we're at the top of the league or we're higher up the league. I would want to see, are we making progression against key metrics over time, while keeping, as Mark says, the other metrics in the right sort of way. So yeah, and there is that piece that, yeah, we can make our 9s look really good, but we're going to affect the rest of the operation. I think
it's also going to be shifting some perspective that's sort of happened and grown over the last couple of years, where we want people to be able to contact us, and the exploring the media, social media as a method of contact to make sure that people who would historically not have picked the phone up have a method. So I get the sneaky suspicion now that perhaps live chat might be down because it's labor intensive. It's got a lot of low risk volume stuff with the odd high risk, but actually you're pulling people away from answering the calls on the 9ers. So I think the priorities potentially could change over the next couple of months, really, just to try and appease that 9er. But
I think there's also a piece for me around the time you answer the call should only be viewed as one element of success. I think there's a quality element there as well. So, for example, you might find that, I'm not saying it always is the case, but you might find that if you're very quick at answering the calls, but you're not delivering a great service in terms of victim care and all that sort of thing, then actually maybe you've not quite got it right. So there's probably multiple facets we're trying to balance off here in that sense.